All right, I guess we'll get started. I'm Gustavo Tandeciarz. I am the Assistant Director for the NFL Players Association. A little bit about me. I was born in Uruguay. I was raised in the United States in Washington, D.C. I've been with the NFL Players Association since 2007. The Assistant Director role has many hats, although now I'm more focused on development instead of what I used to be focused on, which was server infrastructure, server administration, as well as software development. So recently, the most recent project that we did was actually migrating our old website from web forms to Orchard. And I led the Azure infrastructure team on that, as well as I'm also an active Orchard community member, which I recommend to everybody else. Join the community. If you guys aren't on Gitter, get on there. It's fantastic. It's a great way to talk to people and interact. So I don't know if many of you are familiar with the NFL Players Association or the NFL. American football is very big in the United States, very similar to rugby. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. The NFL Players Association is the union that represents all the players, past, present, and future players in the league. What I mean by represent is we support them with any type of litigation issues that they have. We regulate the agents. We support marketing and licensing agreements for them and distribute payments on that sense as well, royalty payments. So why don't we dive in? How did we end up with Orchard? It was actually a 2-month process where we were exploring different options. Like I said before, we were coming back from web forms. That our current websites, we had 2 of them, and I'll get into that in a second, was using web forms. And we needed a unified CMS that was similar to WordPress, but we didn't want to use WordPress because of the PHP backend, the NFLPA. All of our devs are ASP.NET. So we are very, very embedded in Microsoft, and we needed to make sure that whatever solution that we used was an ASP.NET solution so that we can maintain and update it in-house if needed. So that left a couple options. There was Umbraco, there was SharePoint, and there was Orchard. SharePoint we rolled out pretty much immediately. I think everybody else here probably would have done the same, other than the SharePoint developers who. And Umbraco, we looked at that as well, but we liked the interface and the UI from Orchard for the admin portal much better than what Umbraco was offering at the time. This was in the beginning of 2014, so I believe it was Orchard 1.8 was what we were looking at. And so we ended up landing on Orchard. And we definitely wanted to move away from bare metal hosting. So we used to be hosted at Rackspace. This made deployments a little bit cumbersome. Every time we had to deploy, we couldn't scale. We had to copy the files directly to the Rackspace VMs. So we definitely wanted to utilize the cloud technologies, and being a Microsoft shop, we relied heavily on Azure. And Azure was still kind of coming up on its own. It was definitely at a place where we could use it and be confident in the SLA that it provided. But at the same time, it's consistently releasing new features. So part of this process was taking advantage of those new features as we developed the site. So back when I was talking about we had 2 websites, we had a mobile version and a desktop version. And this didn't really work for us because the mobile version, as you can kind of see here, the navigation is very simple, news, videos, and members. So we had a very limited subset of what was offered for the desktop version. And when we looked at the analytics of our website, we noticed that over 50% of our traffic was coming from mobile. And this was happening because of social media sharing and all that. So people would come from a Twitter client directly to our website, and then they wouldn't be able to access anything except for the news articles. So this was a problem. We definitely needed to have a responsive design on a new website. So we utilized Bootstrap, and we ended up with this. And it's one website. It's all managed by Orchard, and it's completely responsive. Every single element on this website folds down, just leveraging Bootstrap to its fullest. And this allowed us to get the same content to every single device that was visiting our website, which was very important to us. We didn't want agents to be limited to having access to our website only from their desktops. We wanted them to be able to be in the field or during negotiations, accessing our website from their iPad and having access to the reports that they needed. So this was huge for us. We also needed to be able to serve content based on the role of the user that was accessing the website. And when I say role, we basically had two types of users. We had the NFLPA staff, and then we had non-staff accounts. Those non-staff accounts were split up across membership roles within the organization, so how they related to the organization. So we have agents, active players, former players, marketing reps, financial advisors. Those are the big roles that we stored inside our internal CRM that we had custom built. And we'll get into that in a little bit in a second as well. We also had media, which we were basically deeming those as non-staff accounts, but those roles were only stored in Orchard. So it was a pretty complex environment that we needed some type of solution for that. And this is what we came up with at launch. It seems pretty complicated, because it is. Initially, the hope was that what we would do is we would move from Orchard authentication, forms authentication, to a single sign-on environment. One of the goals that we were trying to solve for was our membership forgetting their username and passwords, or having to remember their credentials across different partners. So for example, if we had a mobile app, we wanted them to be able to use the same username and password that they used to log into our website to log into the partner mobile app. It just made sense to us, so we architected this in a way that we could eventually migrate from Active Directory to ADFS, and use ADFS for single sign-on and as an IDP for the entire organization and all of our web properties. So just to get into this a little bit, what's happening here is we had two domains. We have the non-staff account domain, and then we have the staff account domain. And we set up a trust where the non-staff domain trusts the staff domain. This allowed us to have staff log into the website using their domain credentials. And we never had to manage any type of user accounts for staff. If the Orchard user account did not exist at point of login, a new staff account would have been created. This is the only instance where a new account is created without any type of manual input. So going back to the Active Directory setup, we had two Active Directories. We had a membership service, so we overrode the authentication provider and the iMembership provider service, so that they would actually look at our Active Directory using the Active Directory library provided by Microsoft. And this was all running on Azure Cloud Services. And so part of this process, I don't know if you can see here, but you authenticate against Active Directory. That authenticates the username and password. We had what we call the Raider Data Warehouse. This is our internal CRM, our NFLPA CRM. This is where we store all of our membership user accounts. And what roles they have within the organization. So we had to have a data warehouse stored in the cloud. That way, we weren't querying our production database on-prem. And we had some issues with the old website where this was a problem, where we had a report that was made public, and it locked out our website and our on-prem CRM. So it was a huge issue that was solved by the data warehouse. So what happens here is it queries the data warehouse using the unique NFLPA ID that's assigned to the user, and then it's able to spit back the roles that they're assigned to. It assigns those roles in Orchard, and those are the roles that they're assigned to throughout the rest of their session. And that's what provides them the access that they need. So one of the issues that we had was we went from an open registration model where we were using web forms and anybody could register on the website, including the general public. So when I mean anybody, I mean anybody. So at some point, we had about 30,000 different user accounts on our website, where maybe about 6,000 of those were actual membership users, agents, players, former players, et cetera. So what we needed to do was we wanted a user to be able, the initial idea was that we wanted the user to be able to log into the website. If they did not have the appropriate role that was required to them, they were supposed to be able to request the role through the website UI. This proved to be a problem during QA because we made it so simple for them to request a role that what that meant was that if we had 50,000 general public members registering on our website and they all wanted the role of agent, they could all go there and all request, hey, I want the agent role, or hey, I want the active player role, and it would inundate staff with emails, and it was just not manageable. So we had to go to an invitation-only process, and that's kind of what you see here. We had a batch create users. We built this thing where you could drag and drop an Excel spreadsheet. It would automatically create the user account, assign them their NFLPA ID, and generate an email that went out, a welcome email to the email address that we had on file, so that with a nonce in the link, so that they go register, set a password, and log in and do what they needed to do. And this worked really well for us. So yeah, that was batch users. So after the first iteration, which was when we were running 2 Active Directory controllers and the read-only domain controller for staff accounts in Azure, we realized quickly that ADFS was probably not going to be the best option for single sign-on. It was going to be very complicated to implement, to manage, and maintain internally in-house. So we opted to move towards storing the non-staff accounts in the Orchard database. And when I say storing the non-staff accounts in the Orchard database, I'm referring to their passwords. So all authentication for non-staff members happens through Orchard, and all authentication for staff accounts still happens through Active Directory. The reason that this was actually another issue, there was actually another technical issue why we had to move to the Orchard database, and that actually has to do with Azure. We launched using cloud services at first, and cloud because we needed to be on the VNet. So because we needed the VNet, the virtual network, to be able to communicate with our domain controllers, we didn't want the domain controller communication to be public. So there was a security risk there that we were solving for. What happened was with cloud services, we could do the set password query using the Active Directory library. But when we wanted to move to Azure Web Apps or Azure websites, that set password query did not work. Everything else worked. We could create new Active Directory accounts. We could edit Active Directory accounts by changing their names, their email address, et cetera. Everything else worked fine except for set password. Obviously, this is a huge problem, right? We can't have users not being able to change their password if they need to. Somebody threw out the idea of, well, why don't we just set their password for them and then just use that? It's like, we can't do that because they need to be able to change it at some point. So that was one of the pushes that sent us back to the Orchard database for those user accounts. We decided with the business rule that staff accounts would not be able to change or manage their password through the website. It's because it's Active Directory based, it's organization based. They're managing their passwords within Active Directory. Control-Alt-Delete, change your password. So this worked out well, and the workflow was a little bit simplified here. We started with the login request, goes to either Active Directory based on the username that you're passing in or the Orchard database. It authenticates. If it's a staff account and the staff account does not exist in Orchard, it creates a new Orchard user account. Then it goes through the membership role assignment form and goes back to the website, and that's your session. Any questions on that? Anybody want to know any more details? Yep. We actually wrote, the question was, what did we use to do the AD authentication for Orchard? We wrote PCL, our own library, and we stood up our own little NuGet server as well on Azure. So we deployed that to an internal NuGet server so that we can disseminate that through all developers, and they can get updates as we're updating that library. Anything else on that? No? Great. So what was another benefit from moving to Orchard? Previously, what we had was we had the mobile app, which had its own CMS, which was all custom web forms. We had the website, which had its own CMS, all custom web forms. We had some content stored in Google Calendar. We had another CMS for a separate mobile app. So, I mean, as you can tell, for staff to be able to update content, they need to remember, hey, I need to update this content here. I also need to update here, here, and here. Or, more importantly and catastrophically, if a user needs to be disabled, the user needs to be disabled here, 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 and here. And that was a big problem for us. We wanted all of our content for our mobile apps, for our website, to all be stored in one place. You post it once, it's available everywhere. So that is another thing that Orchard gave us. We built some custom APIs for our Player Planner app, which is one of our mobile apps. That way, so for example, membership discounts, those are available on our website as content items, and they're also available to the mobile app via a custom API that sends that out to the user. And that is all based on roles, and it's role filtered, et cetera. So this was great. We also ended up having we built a couple of admin tools because, when you have staff, general staff, editing content on the website, we opted to not use structured content. We did everything unstructured. So basically, they just have one big WYSIWYG editor on the page, and they could just drop in the content. This was before layouts was a thing. So they could come in, drop in the content, and they would have to know the classes and everything to assign to that content. So, and table generation on responsive web design is really, really complicated for general staff who are not experienced with responsive web design. So we built a responsive web design table generator, which basically they just take an Excel spreadsheet with their columns, roles, and content, and using JavaScript, it drops it into the source and renders it out in a responsive format. And this was really good for staff because then they could just copy and paste that source and put it wherever they needed to, in a blog post or on a page, and it actually worked out pretty well. Another thing that we provided staff was with the pattern library, which is similar to kind of what Layouts is going to provide, where editors can come in here and they can see different elements of what we provide them based on our style sheets. And you can't really tell here, but there's a drop down here, and that gives you the source code. So they can take that source code, drop it into the WYSIWYG editor, and then edit the content that they need. This works well, but ideally we're going to move towards layouts and be able to manage that and control it a little bit better. So that's one of the things that we're doing in the future. So another issue that we were able to solve when we were before at Rackspace, that bare metal, we couldn't scale. So that's something that Azure gave us. It gave us the ability to scale. And when we originally deployed, we deployed Orchard 1.8 to Azure Cloud Services. And there were 2 large cloud service instances. We weren't using any type of output caching here because we had some issues before with the output caching. We were only using in-memory. We weren't using a distributed caching service. Redis wasn't available yet on Azure. And I think Redis came out with 1.9. And that's when we actually implemented output caching. So you can imagine everybody who's coming to our website, there's no caching, so they're all hitting the database. So this was a big problem, and especially if we sent out like a tweet or something on a press release that was really important or really popular, we would get spikes of 20,000 people at the same exact moment, and that was crashing our website. It was really bad because our communications department would get upset. They'd send out this really high-profile press release, and then our website would crash. Nobody would get to read it. And what we were hoping to accomplish with cloud services was take advantage of the auto-scale functionality. And this ended up being kind of a limitation for cloud services because the auto-scale happened on a timer. And what would happen is it would query every instance on the CPU, and if the CPU was pegged for a certain amount of time, then would start spinning up a new instance, spin it up by 2 instances or 4 instances, et cetera. But that time was 30 minutes. And that obviously didn't work. We couldn't wait 30 minutes for new instances to come up and then the additional warm-up of 5 or 10 minutes for each of those instances. So unfortunately, we were stuck with cloud services until Orchard 1.9 when we actually moved to Azure Web Apps. And here's an example of a spike in traffic where we published this is the general traffic. And this is about 2,000 to 3,000 not concurrent sessions, but sessions on the website for the day. And that spike, we were hitting 20,000 concurrent sessions. We were looking at the real-time traffic in Google Analytics and just like, okay, that's bad. And the number just kept climbing and climbing and climbing. Luckily, this article came out after we migrated to Azure Websites and Orchard 1.9 and implemented output caching. In fact, output caching works so well that we haven't had to scale since we implemented it. Because we realized that the majority of our public traffic is public traffic. They're not logged in. So there's no need to scale that up. If it's all going to be the same content going out. If you send out a tweet, they're coming to a website, it's the general public, they're not logged in, we don't have to worry about that database access there. So what happened to our infrastructure was we cut out the cloud services, and we cut out the virtual machines that were the domain controllers for the non-staff accounts. And this helped us reduce cost, as well as support easier deployments, which I'm going to get into in a second. We also added the Redis distributed cache, and that allowed us to scale up if we needed to, although we haven't needed to. And the big thing that helped us make the decision to move to Azure Web Apps versus cloud services was when Azure Web Apps supported VNet access. I mean, that was huge because we needed to be able to communicate with our read-only domain controller to do those authentication processes, behind the scenes, so we still needed that VNet access. We also have all of our logging done to Elasticsearch, and that Elasticsearch instance is also on the VNet. And we don't want to expose Elasticsearch to the public because it's just all based on REST. So that would be a pretty big risk. So yeah, once they implemented VNet support with Azure websites, it was really no-brainer to switch over. And here's another benefit which was a surprise to me, and it was fantastic. We could do piecemeal deployments now. Before, with cloud services, you'd have to deploy the role, the Azure role. I don't know, how many people here are experienced with Azure cloud services and platform? Everybody from Microsoft, pretty much? Yeah, OK. So when you're deploying a cloud service, you have to deploy a role. And what that does is basically creates a VM per role with a separate file system. So if you ever needed to do any updates and you wanted to do those without having to do a full deployment, you actually had to remote into those VMs and have to update those files manually. And that was a huge pain because sometimes these updates were just to a module, and it was like maybe one line of code update, like a quick bug fix. And we'd have to do a full-on deployment, which could take an hour. Azure Websites lets us actually set up an FTP profile, and we can deploy directly to the modules folder. So for example, in this example, let's say I edited some style sheets. It's literally 2 clicks. Right-click styles, publish styles, goes to Azure Websites. It's a shared file system. It's available across all of our web instances at that point. We did this with modules. So if we ever made any changes to a custom module, we just right-click on that module project and publish that project, and that publishes directly to the modules folder on the Azure web app. And it just works. It works beautifully. Azure handles all the file rewrites, overwrites, and any files that are currently in use. It was great. Azure Websites really helped us speed up our deployment process. Now, a simple 2-line change literally takes 5 seconds to deploy, and the IT department doesn't fear these constant changes. Oh, can you make the font a little bit bigger? Can you add this? Or we have a bug that we need to fix. It's quick. Any questions on the Azure deployment stuff? Because that's huge. If you guys aren't using it and you guys are on Azure Web Apps, it's pretty awesome. So this is a good example of what we're logging to. This is using Elasticsearch and Kibana. All of our error logs are logging both to the file system as well as Elasticsearch. But we're also taking that a step further, and we're doing audit logs. This was before the audit module came out. And we were auditing logins, failed login attempts, and access to reports. So whenever an agent would view a report on our website, it would be logged here, the agent username, their IP address, which report they were accessing, and what variables they accessed. We had to blur some things out here to keep it a little bit, the proprietary information proprietary. But this is all interactive. So I could actually drill down here, select, highlight, and see only the logs for that timestamp. Same thing, there's a drop down here where you could select, show me only the logs in the last hour, or show me the last 6 months, for example. They all had time to live, so it's self-cleaning. And Elasticsearch worked out really well for us. We were able to diagnose many bugs that we were having when we first launched Orchard because of this Elasticsearch module. And here's another tool that we used. I mean, you can all guess that this is all just fake data, but we're not showing you the machine key. Yeah, so another thing that we had, yeah, take a picture. Well, it's going to be on YouTube. Another issue that we ran into with cloud services was caching, because the cloud services, I don't know if you recall, they're each their own VM. So the in-memory cache is unique to each instance that's deployed. So one of the problems was we were adding new content types. This was right when we were populating all the content on the website. We were adding new content types, and what would happen was there was no affinity between the cloud service and the browser session. And what that meant was the user would create a new content type, and when the page refreshed, 404, content type doesn't exist, because it bounced to the other cloud service. And that was a pretty big problem. So we wanted to make sure that this wasn't going to be an issue with Azure Web Apps. Because the Azure Web Apps, the way those work is, I don't know if anybody is familiar with that, but it's a shared file system. They're all using the same file system, but they're different instances, in-memory instances. So if you have in-memory cache, it's going to be affected by the Azure Web App. It's not going to populate across instances. So we built this little module that basically allowed you to select different instances that the website was deployed to. And this works with Azure Web Apps. So Azure Web Apps uses a cookie, the ARR affinity cookie, that has the instance ID in it. And we were using the Azure SDK to be able to grab the instance IDs of the other instances that were deployed to Azure. And then we could just, with JavaScript, swap out that cookie, refresh the page, and now we're on the other instance. It worked out really well. Fortunately, we never had any of these caching issues that we had with cloud services on web apps. But, I mean, you never know. So going back to Elasticsearch and the audit logging and reporting, this is kind of the high-level infrastructure that we have set up for our audit logging system. We are using Telerik reports. Is anybody familiar with Kendo UI or Telerik? So, yep, great. OK, a few of you. So the hope was that we'd be able to make these reports responsive, because that was the main goal of the website, making everything responsive. Before, the reports were just showing a standard table or XML data on the page. They were ASP.NET web forms. They weren't interactive really in any way except being able to type in a field, et cetera. So moving to Telerik really helped us enhance the support that we provided for our reports, and the reports are primarily used by our agents. What a report is, for example, being able to search for a player, getting their contract details, and then being able to search for and look at other players who are in a similar position. So quarterbacks, I want to look at quarterbacks across the league. What is their salary across the board, so that when I'm renegotiating my quarterback salary, I have something to compare to. So we definitely wanted to make that more accessible to our agents. And Telerik was a good solution for that. But the issue with Telerik reporting was that it was keeping the session ID on file storage. And this didn't work for cloud services. So the Telerik reporting does support database for sessions, but it didn't support Azure SQL. And that was a problem for us. So we had to remain with the general file storage for the session ID. Basically, it just writes a file to the app data folder with like a unique ID in it, and that stores your session information for that report. This didn't work in cloud services, because if you bounce from one cloud service to another, that file didn't exist, and now you would lose your session. And we were getting a bunch of errors with that. And ironically, we also get errors with Azure Web Apps. So we think that there might be an issue with caching in that scenario. So what we ended up doing was we spun up another single instance Azure Web App that works as our reporting API. And what happens is when you request a report on our website, it does an authentication query. It sends basically a pre-flight to this other web service. And we have some decorators that it's basically a filter. And that uses an API that does a REST call back to Orchard based on the user account to get the appropriate roles and the name of the report that they're trying to view. And then Orchard returns saying, hey, yes, you are allowed to view this report, or no, you're not allowed to view the report. And then the reporting service actually runs the report and sends back the details. And all of this stuff is audited to Elasticsearch. Anybody have any questions on that? That's pretty complicated, but I mean, it seems pretty good. OK, great. So we did this in 9 months. We migrated from 2 websites, mobile and desktop, as well as a mobile app. And we were able to migrate all of the content, design the infrastructure, and get everything ready to go in 9 months. We started planning in December. We did what's called the discovery phase, where we basically have a month where the vendor comes in, Applied Information Sciences. The reason we actually picked AIS, that vendor, was because they also designed our internal CRM. So they had a lot of background into the type of information that we were going to be utilizing on the website. They had that experience behind them. They're also a Microsoft partner, and they have previous experience with Orchard. So they were great for that. So that planning and discovery phase lasted about a month, where they would come in, we would sit with different departments and say, hey, we're redesigning a new website. What do you guys want? What are the features that you need? What do you guys need from the old website moved over to the new website? And we ended up coming up with about 231 different features that required custom development within Orchard. So part of that, then the next phase was setting up the Azure infrastructure, obviously, because you can't really deploy or test anything without infrastructure. And then we started development. And we launched in September of 2014 with Orchard 1.8.1. 8.1? Yeah, 8.1. And that's where we were. And we use TFS for all of this. We use Team Foundation version control. So like we said, we're heavily embedded with Microsoft. So any Microsoft product that we can use, we try to use it. And we had continuous integration set up. So every time we did a commit, much like on Git, where if you do a commit or a pull request, it'll run a build, and if that build succeeds, it lets you know. If it doesn't, it lets you know. Managed our backlog here. We were using Agile Scrum methodologies to do this, and it worked out pretty well. In hindsight, something that I would do differently is instead of using Team Foundation version control, I would just use Git, now that TFS supports Git for version control. And that actually, one of the reasons is being able to merge updates from Orchard into our code base. What we ended up having to do, because we were running on TFS, we weren't able to use Git, so we couldn't do any type of, set up this repository, point in here, pull from the Orchard code base and merge. We actually had to use a program called Beyond Compare. So we would download the latest Orchard release, and this, yeah, I see some people getting a little hurt. Yeah, and this is what we have to do today still. Where every Orchard release comes in, because we have so much customization to, for example, the libs folder, we had to use the Azure SDK, and at the time that we launched, I believe that we were using Azure SDK 2.4 or 2.5, and we actually needed to use Azure SDK 2.7 for a couple of the features that we were going for. So we updated that SDK in the lib folder. Same thing with identity. We're starting to implement identity, which is now running in our QA environment. So we're using ThinkTexture for that. And that requires update to Newtonsoft JSON. So we're using 7.0 for that one. And that required a bunch of web config updates. So you can imagine that when we open up Beyond Compare, you're going to see a bunch of differences. The only benefit here is that we can actually dive into the modules and copy, like let's say we know we didn't edit the Orchard Layouts module. We'll just copy the Orchard Layouts module content over. We don't have to do it file by file. Beyond Compare lets us do that. And it's really quick. If anybody here hasn't really used it and they're doing this type of workflow to merge releases, go for it. If we can figure out a different way to merge releases, let's do that. Because this is a sticking point. It takes a couple hours to go to the next release. So what are we working on now? We're working on single sign-on. We're going to work on updated layouts for the UI for the front end, and we want it to be, our marketing department came back and they want it to have a more interactive and, the buzzwords like, clean and modern UI. So we're working with them to redesign that design for the news and landing pages. And we also need to add another feature, which is related content. So if you're looking at a news article, you can see other news articles that are related, so prompting users to be able to discover content on our site instead of just going to one and then getting a quick bounce and then leaving. Single sign-on is the big one right now. Like I said, we have it in QA. We're using ThinkTexture Identity Server. We have 2 modules for that created. We have the server module, and then we have a client module. The server module runs at the identity server self-host implementation, and the client module is what Orchard uses to look at that identity server, identity provider for processing roles and authentication. And I can get into that in detail offline if anybody has any questions on how we're implementing that. But it's working out pretty well. So another thing that we want to do, and the reason we're moving to the single sign-on is because one of my ideas, and I'm trying to sell it to the rest of the organization, is having the idea of user dashboards where they can just go to like my.nflpa.com and all the content that is relevant to them and their role is available on in that area in a dashboard format. Right now, all of the private content is mixed in with the public content, so it makes it very difficult to find what you're looking for. And to compound that, we have searches that are specific for former players, but we also have that in the active players section, like membership discounts. So that's in 2 places, and it becomes very difficult for the user to be able to find that content. My.nflpa.com is going to require multi-tenancy, so we're also designing single sign-on to support for multi-tenancy. And we built a feature where, within the single sign-on module, that if you enable that feature and you add a new tenant, I don't know if a lot of people here are versed with identity, but you have to specify the referring URL and the redirect URL. So that way, the person who is authenticating, the server knows that, hey, this application is allowed to authenticate to our system. What the feature does is it actually auto-generates that. So you create a new tenant. That new tenant is either prefixed or it's a subdomain, and it's going to automatically add that URL to both the post-logout redirect URL and the redirect URL. So hopefully that'll be good when we actually launch this feature later this year. Some other things that are coming down the line is cache content for authenticated users. One of the complaints that we've gotten back from our membership is that the site is a little bit slow after they log in, and that's because they're logged in. It's not cached. It's got to hit the database. And on the system, I had a screenshot of on my computer. I had a screenshot of Azure SQL Server auditing services, and in any given span of 24 hours, we're doing over 1 million queries to the database, which seems a lot because it is. It's a huge amount. And that might go back into the other presentation where Glimpse, where they were able to cut down the number of queries on the layers by half. So hopefully that'll be able to reduce the amount of chatter that we have between the application and the database itself. So that's pretty much where we are. Anybody have any additional questions? Yep. Yeah. Nope, not on. Check, check. Is a switch at the bottom?
Yeah. You said that one of your bottlenecks was the amount of database queries. I was just wondering if you had database cache enabled or not.
We did at one point, and we ended up having to disable that because that was causing some problems.
Because it's not distributed.
Yeah, it wasn't distributed, right.
Does it, Azure database cache you can enable? Did you try
Oh,
with that?
Azure? No, we haven't.
No.
No. We're using Azure V12 SQL Server instances.
No, there's a cache layer that targets app traffic cache.
Okay,
database.
yeah, no, we're not using that.
No. Okay.
Interesting that. Is that a new release? Is it in preview?
No.
No? Oh, okay,
No.
great. Yeah, something to look into. And that's why we're here. Yeah, okay. One question back.
Would you be able to explain a little bit about your Elasticsearch infrastructure, and did you look at the Azure Search Service at all?
Yeah, we didn't look at the Azure Search Service because I was looking at the original. It was basically between storing these audit logs. The whole reason we built this was for audit logging, and we were first looking at implementing the audit logs in the SQL Server database. But what that meant was that only DBAs would really be able to access those audit logs, and that would put a lot of load on them if somebody needed to say, hey, who accessed this report on this date because it got leaked to the media. We wanted to be able to do that very quickly. So one of the things that Elasticsearch gave us was the ability to query very fast, and it had Kibana basically built in. So we didn't have to build any front-end UIs to kind of interact with that. We didn't have to do any type of special configuration. All we really had to do was use the Nest library for Elasticsearch, tie that into Log4net, and it just worked. It worked fantastically.
And you just run it in a VM with
We're running
Java
it as a cloud service with 3 separate nodes, 3 different instances, and they're small Linux instances, so super cheap. We can scale that up and scale that down on the fly. We actually have a script, so whenever we deploy a new VM, a new Linux VM, we run a bash script, and it's immediately configured. It downloads Elasticsearch, installs it. It downloads Kibana, installs it, sets up Nginx, Apache, all that stuff. It's all pre-configured on that. We were exploring using Docker at some point, but we just didn't have the time and resources to implement that. So the script works.
Very cool.
Yeah, thanks.
How many users are using your intranet or the private website?
On the previous website?
Yeah.
We had, I think, something along the lines of close to 30,000 registered members. They were not what we consider NFLPA members, so they didn't have like a role within our internal CRM, so they weren't an agent or an active player. A lot of this was like the general public. On our old website, we used to have these trivias as well, but you had to register to be able to, fill out the trivia form and to be able to receive the prize. So that brought in a ton of registration. We cut that down now to, I think, about close to 9,000 registered members on our site. And the majority of that is actually former players, which is great because we're trying to reach out to former players as much as we can.
Did you have any concurrency problem with Orchard or similar?
Concurrency in what sense?
About some document that 3 people tried to update at the same time, or some log or statistic number, no so.
No, mostly because we have a very small staff at the organization. The NFLPA is about 120 people. I think there's maybe 3 or 4 people who are updating content on the website at any given time. So we haven't had any type of concurrency issues in that sense. And for the general public, no problems there because it's, it's all cached. So it's going back, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Great. Any more questions? No? Okay, cool. Thank you, everybody.